Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first episode of Cinemarx. If you're not already following everything that the co-op is doing, I encourage you to hit the follow and subscribe and all that those buttons, because there's a lot of cool stuff going on, which we can talk about at the end. But tonight we are going to talk about a movie that I think it's not exactly a cult classic, but it had a big it's notable, I think, as a work, and that is American Psycho. Um, and so first of all, a disclaimer. Obviously, American Psycho is a movie which is very confronting in a number of different ways. It's very graphic. I'm not going to be using any of the particularly graphic images today, but just I guess keep that in mind. And the way that I want to talk about the movie is by putting it in the context of Marxist theory, particularly the theory of class. Like, so what is a class? What is the ruling class? What is the working class? Why do they have a different set of ideas to the working class? And then also talk about how I think the movie represents that sort of thing. I also thoroughly encourage anybody if they've got any questions or comments. I'm watching the chat, so please do feel free to interject as much as you like. Yeah, so I guess the first thing is I guess talking about what is the Marxist definition of class, and the definition is about the relationship that a person has to what Marx refers to as the means of production, which is basically just the ability to create wealth in a society. In common cases include factories or big tracts of land to be able to produce crops and that sort of thing. But it equally applies to financial capital as well, which is the sort of capitalist that we see in the protagonist of American Psycho, Bateman. And one of the reasons that I wanted to frame it in this context is because a lot of Bateman's actions, and in general, I think a lot of real life ruling class figures do things that seem completely and utterly alien to most ordinary people. Completely just either without compassion or obviously they're a group that don't consider the needs of their fellow human beings. They're the people who are responsible for climate change. They're the people who insist on building pipelines through stolen indigenous land. The list goes on. And I wanted to talk about that because it's not it's not like I'm to borrow an alt-right sort of idea. They're not lizard people, but it comes down to whether what they're doing advances their own interests as a class, which the ruling class, they're all about accumulating wealth and accumulating as much profit and doing so in order to, that's the way they advance themselves in society. By contrast, people who are in the working class do so in a very, very collaborative and cooperative way. As a worker, you can't single-handedly run a car factory or whatever. You do so in collaboration with hundreds of other workers who run hundreds of other bits of machinery and whatever. No single thing is produced by a single member of the working class. It's always a very social process. And the argument that Marx makes is that that process lends itself to a very keen sense Yes? Oh, okay, lovely. All right, sorry about that, everyone. I've totally lost my train of thought. Uh, okay. Is that better? Okay. It keeps like switching microphones, I think. Okay. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me? Hello? Is that working? No? You, oh, okay. Okay, fantastic. All right. Okay. Well, I think that might be okay for the moment. we will see if that happens again. I'm sorry, everybody, for that. Okay, so back to what I was saying, which is that yes, so there's a big contrast between the psychology of the working class and the psychology of the ruling class. And I think that's one of the reasons that American Psycho is such a confronting kind of film. And yeah, so it's that distinction that I think is a really key part of understanding the film, but also understanding like ruling class psychology more generally. So yeah, one of the the themes of the film is this idea that Bateman isn't so much like a person as a just a figure, you know, a shadow almost. Somebody who doesn't actually have like is not a person in the truest sense of the word, but is just somebody who's, I guess, doing what he can to fit in, and well, like to fit in, particularly into the environment he's in, which is a Wall Street banker kind of capitalist role. And there's a number of examples of this throughout the film, which I've got some pictures of. I think you can see that now. Where, yeah, he has this really keen obsession, both with his appearance, the appearance of his secretary, and like the people around him. Like that's a sort of a key feature of his interactions with basically everybody else in the film, aside from the people he's actively murdering, is all focused on both his appearance and how he appears relative to the people he's competing against. Because at the end of the day, you know, despite them being colleagues in the same, you know, Wall Street firm or whatever, they're all in line for, you know, the biggest accounts. They're all trying to make the biggest profits for their company, you know, and that's that sort of like directly competitive nature is something that I think is also a key part of ruling class psychology, and is something that comes out pretty clearly in the film. Yeah, so let's move on to talk about some of the violence, I think, because obviously that's a very, very, you know, key and like core point of the film. And I mean, like people who are not looking at the film in a super critical way just see a film about some crazy guy who's going on murdering sprees, but I think it's more deep than that. I think there's a pattern. To the violence, and I think that starts with the first example of that we see, which is his murder of a random homeless guy. He uses capitalism to justify violence. I think it's more complicated than his own justification. Like, obviously, I think the two are very, very closely related, but I think it's more that this, like the psychology of the ruling class and the psychology of capitalists is one that is intimately linked with and prone to violence, because that's one of the means that they use to be able to get ahead, is they have to be brutal and ruthless towards the people they're competing against, and they have to be brutal and ruthless towards the people they are exploiting. No Wall Street banker is going to get anywhere by having a heart and trying to invest in, less profitable or not profitable at all, green energy or, why would you invest in green energy when you could invest in like fossil fuels, which have been shown to time and time again be a huge part of the basics of the world's economy. There's an institutional bent to it as well as the sort of individual bent, which I think the individual bent is more what you see in the film. But I think that it's worth raising the institutional thing as well. Capitalism as a system is one that is full of institutional violence. If somebody's starving in the streets or homeless, or that's not an accident. That's because the system is set up to be one which housing can be unaffordable. It's set up to be one where food can be priced out of people's range, and is not something that is available to everyone, but is like they have to buy in, or I don't want to say buy into the system because that implies that they've got a choice. I don't think the working class has a choice when it comes to the involvement they have with the system. Marx actually has a good quote about this, which is they're free in a double sense. They're free to sell their labor and free to starve, basically. I'm paraphrasing, but yeah, it's like, and that's a definitional thing about the working class. By definition, as a class and as individuals, they have no ability to produce any means of survival. And so they have to sell their labor in order to survive. And therefore, they are subject to all of the gross institutional whims that, that capitalism produces. Yeah, it's it absolutely is gross. And there's a real project, I think, in addition to being obsessed with their appearance in relation to one another, the ruling class, have to be keenly aware of how they portray themselves to the working class as a whole, because they have to, in some sense, sell the system or imply that the system is more good-hearted or more human-oriented than it actually is, because without an illusory layer, without being able to ideologically convince people that the system is worth keeping somehow, there's no reason why working class people would put up with that if that was just sort of barefaced in front of them. And that's where things like racism and that's where things like homophobia, all that sort of stuff come into play. But it also comes into play when it's when they're in the public eye. So there's one particular scene where Bateman is doing this moralistic grandstanding, and part of it is about again making himself seem more significant in the eyes of others, and making himself seem more politically astute, more socially aware. But at the end of the day, the thing that he actually says, and I wanted to write it down and reiterate or read it out, because it's actually incomprehensible nonsense. He says, well, we have to end apartheid for one, and slow down the nuclear arms race, stop terrorism and world hunger. We have to provide food and shelter for the homeless, and oppose racial discrimination, promote civil rights, while also promoting gender equality. We have to encourage a return to traditional moral values. Most importantly, we have to promote general social concern and less materialism in young people. Now, aside from being internally contradictory, particularly the point about traditional moral values, His whole life is based around an obsession of the material and he is the very evil that he's trying to suggest needs to be changed. And I think that's one thing that the ruling class try and distance themselves from these issues of society, as though they're some sort of like huge issue that can't be solved in one day sort of thing. But it's not really true. Like hunger, for example, the world produces enough food to feed 10 or 12 billion people, I think the figure is. The same thing is true of housing. There's like 10 houses for every one homeless person. The nuclear arms race is an example of, or is a consequence of imperialism, which is something that's is a very direct consequence of the way that capitalist nations are set up. So the moralistic grandstanding comes through to me as an example of how the ruling class try and make it seem like they're not the ones who are responsible for the social grotesqueness that exists in our society. And of course, individually speaking, there's not necessarily, one particular capitalist who's responsible for the arms race, or one particular capitalist who's responsible for all of the homelessness. But as a group, as a class, that's exactly what their interests are aligned with. Like, you can't have a housing market and you can't have speculation on food prices, or you can't have commodity production without denying it to some group of society. And that's, I think, a really, really key point. It's like, even if a particular individual capitalist is not responsible for, directly responsible, it's the system that they've set up, it's the system that they're invested in, which has an investment and has an interest in maintaining that system, maintaining violence towards, indigenous peoples, wars, all that sort of thing. So the violence starts with the example of that homeless guy he stabs, but it quickly escalates. No one is spared. No one group in society is targeted. He kills an old woman at one point. He, murders numerous prostitutes, or I don't know if that's the appropriate term for sex workers. Let's go with sex workers. He murders colleagues. He, nobody's spared when it comes to his bloodlust. The difference is about the motivations. The motivation for him was just when it comes to the sort of more oppressed groups, the homeless guy and the sex workers, it's more about him feeling powerful. The co-worker he kills is actually pretty directly a competitor and somebody who he sees as a threat. And obviously he's very happy to satisfy both his bloodlust and his need to subdue this existential threat at the same time. But but I think the distinction is an important thing to talk about as well, or to be aware of. So it's also worth saying that capitalism as a system systematically devalues human beings. And that's another way that psychologically the ruling class can be very
distant and uncaring from the suffering that exists in the world is that they don't see human beings as a whole, as, you know, as people, as having a personhood. They see them as commodities. You hear the way that like ruling class people talk about work like workers, and you know, or you know, any number of like mass groups of people. You know, it's always tinged with this sort of disgust and derision that they have towards those groups of people. There's one example that comes to mind of a capitalist here in Australia, Gina Reinhardt. She's like a mining boss, you know, so directly, you know, invested in the dispossession of Indigenous peoples and the destruction of the climate and the planet. But she, at one point, said that Australian workers should be willing to work for $2 an hour in order to compete with those overseas. The living cost in Australia per day is like in the $50 to $60 range at least. So effectively, she's saying, I don't care whether or not you're able to meet your basic needs. I don't care whether or not like you have a life outside of work. You should be willing to sell yourself to the system regardless of anything else. And so that I can continue to exploit you and make profits off of your labor. Yeah, so I think that's one of the points that I wanted to make here as well, is that the way that that Bateman sees other people as not as individuals, it's not as people with some sort of autonomy. It's they're obstacles at best, or playthings, and that's evident in a number of his like sort of more sick habits, let's say. But it's just as obvious when it comes to his interactions with his secretary, or the detective that comes through at one point. Yeah. I'd love to hear, like, the chat's been a bit quiet, but if anybody's got questions or comments that they want to make about it, I'd love to hear more. Like, you know, as much as I love the sound of my own voice. Yeah, there's a number of points that are made, like in terms of, obviously it's a story, and in that sense, yeah, exactly. Like the ruling class are very, very happy to suggest others take pay cuts because that makes their profit lines bigger. Absolutely. Yeah, well, that's one of the reasons that I wanted to talk about it in this context, is like capitalism as a system is extraordinarily inconsiderate. And there's a certain amount of, I guess, salt to be taken with, you know, obviously, you know, Bret Easton Ellis is not a Marxist. You know, he's obviously, the book was written with the idea of Bateman being like the concept of like corporations as personhood, what that would look like, I think was the sort of idea that, that he was trying to experiment with. And I think as an idea, it's a very useful one to explore. But I think I don't want to say that, you know, American Psycho is a piece of Marxist literature because it demonstrates some considerate things, or some, not considerate things, some salient points about capitalism as a system. Yeah. There's also a number of readings of the film which talk about the film being an example of like a misogynist text because the violence is so heavily focused on sex workers and on women. And obviously, like, Bateman is absolutely a misogynist as a character, but I don't think that necessarily makes the text, like, there's a difference between portraying something in order to demonstrate its violence and it's like, and critique it and be critical of it, and just reproducing it. And I think the goal, and I think it's achieved, the goal of the film and the book is to portray violence against, and there's nothing sympathetic about any of the violence. Like, it's always sickening and horrific. You know, there's a real focus on, like, every person who gets murdered by him, you know, is like, there's at least a little bit of time taken to humanize them to the audience before they get murdered. So yeah, I guess I just wanted to disagree with that reading of it. You know, like, obviously, reproducing violence towards women is something you need to be very cautious of in a text. But I think in this case, maybe it didn't have to be quite so egregious. But the shocking, it's supposed to be shocking. It's supposed to be, you know, disquieting. And I think it's, like, the idea is to bring to bear, like, some of the more shocking elements of, like, for me, capitalism is a system. For the authors, it's about, you know, corporations and that sort of thing, which there's a lot of parallels with, but not necessarily, it's not necessarily exactly the same thing, but anyway. The conclusion of the film. The conclusion of the film is one where it's not exactly clear what's happened. Bateman goes on a killing spree, in which there's some kind of surreal elements as well. And at the end, like, the end of it is him going into his office and calling his lawyer and confessing to 30 or 40 murders or whatever it is. And the following day, the scene is they're at the gentleman's club or whatever it is. And he talks to the lawyer and he says, like, you know, the lawyer thinks it's a joke. And Bateman's like, no, really, I have killed all of these people. I might be in some serious crap here. I might need your help to get me off. And the ironic thing is that the conclusion of the film is he doesn't need to be rescued from, like, the state. The state just stops looking for him. The state has never been actually a threat to him, as, like, regardless of his violence, regardless of his, you know, like, atrocious tendencies. And I think that's a significant thing as well. The way that the film ends and makes the point, I think, that there's a lot of violence that happens, like, by the system, by corporations, by individuals in the ruling class. And those individuals in the ruling class, those corporations, get away with it. Like, 99% of the time, they get away with literal murder, they get away with sexual assault, they get away with all sorts of things, you know, and there's been a number of examples of that, you know, in recent memory. Obviously, Trump is an example of somebody who boasts of sexually assaulting women, and has had people come out and say, you know, he sexually assaulted me, and has got off scot-free. Because that's an essential part of the system, actually, at the end of the day, is that regardless of whether or not working class people are allowed to get away with the sorts of things that ruling class people do, Yeah, exactly. 14 months for a multi-billion-dollar bank scam, 25 years for stealing $100. The more desperate you are, the more needy you are, the more the state cracks down on you. Because if you're at the head of a multi-million-dollar bank scam or a multi-billion-dollar bank scam, you're essentially doing what capitalism is asking of you. You're like trying to make as much profit as possible. And the state sometimes has to step in and say, look, you know, you're cutting us out too much of the loop here. We have to do something. It's always a slap on the wrist. And part of that is the respectability that they go on about. Part of that is, you know, they're all in the same clubs together. They all know each other. They're all, you know, the people who were appointed to be, you know, judges and all sorts of things. Like, they're all appointed by various, like, they all sit on boards with each other. There's a whole social network of the ruling class. And that's an extremely valuable tool. It's one of the reasons that, like, you know, again, Bateman is an example of this. Like, they are obsessed with their appearances because, like, that helps to distinguish them from the working class and also helps them to move in those ruling class circles. And yeah, so I think that's a really significant point that the film makes, that capitalism can literally get away with murder, regularly does literally get away with murder. And I think the lesson for I don't know if that's bait or not. The oligarchical failings of communism are similar to the cronyism of capitalistic systems. If you're referring by communism specifically to, like, the Cold War USSR kind of system, then I would say actually fundamentally they were the same system. They, like, there's a whole school of thought that is like all about analyzing whether or not the revolution of 1917 necessarily led to the creation of just a different system, a different social system, or if it was another form of capitalism. And I believe, and I actually have been doing a bunch of reading about it recently. Like, I literally have a book right here. State capitalism is the theory. The USSR, the way I see it, is that it fundamentally was a system that still exploited workers. It still had profit as a central motive. The distinction between the communist countries and the democracies or the capitalist countries is not about the system itself. It's about who controls the profits. And in the case of the USSR, it was about the state bureaucracy controlling the profits and the system more than the, you know, the private capitalists. But nevertheless, it was still involved in a huge amount of trade with the rest of the world, and that all takes place on the basis of a capitalist interaction. Like, you can't do lots of, like, exports and imports and, like, not still be preserving, and you would still be preserving the profit motive. Yeah, I mean, the history of the Russian Revolution has a huge number of points of detail that I would love to get into, but, like, we probably don't necessarily have time to do it at the moment. I think that, suffice to say, I think that Stalin and his cronies were capitalists and, like, murderous bastards. Yeah, I'm sure I can come up with something for that. But I still think that the objective and the goals and the motives and the methods of the Bolshevik Party in the lead up to the revolution, and indeed, I think you're right in saying that, you know, their ideals had some grip to them still post-revolution. Yeah, but the revolution was ultimately defeated, rather than, and it wasn't a military defeat, you know, they technically won the Civil War. It was defeated by the fact that socialism necessarily has to be a society that is global. Capitalism will not stand for the existence of a section of like working class power. Yeah, I'm just trying to work out how much we can get into this on like there's been like books and books and books written about it. Yeah. Oh, yeah, I mean, Wall Street is definitely like fucking atrocious, and monsters, a lot of them. The manifesto doesn't exactly touch on the defeat of the Russian Revolution, but suffice to say, the points that are relevant are about the working class taking power for themselves, not by, like, it's not the working class like being represented by some state bureaucracy, which is what happened, you know, sort of post 1928. So it, like, for context of like the political strains that come out of that, Trotsky was a big opponent of Stalin and of the direction that the USSR went and was going at the time. And he spent a lot of time and energy trying to organize an alternative ideological current, and failing that, he was exiled from the country, and eventually assassinated by one of Stalin's cronies. But yeah, like, one of the important things about so there's the point about the working class needing to achieve a society on their own. Like, they can't be liberated externally. It's the working class for the working class, not the working class as a prop used by some, you know, bureaucracy or whatever. And which has been the case in a separate like group, like the bourgeois revolutions, actually, you know, the French Revolution particularly needed the political mass of, they weren't working class then technically, but the political mass of like peasants and sort of like embryonic proletarian elements to be on side. And that's why they espoused that thing about liberty, equality, and fraternity, and then denied women the vote, you know? Like, they had to ideologically sell their revolution to that, like, to get the working class on side. Or not, yeah, like I said, they're not actually the working class by definition, because like capitalism is still being developed economically at that stage. Wow, that's a tangent. Yes, but the thing about the manifesto is it has a particular point in it where it talks about the historical usefulness of capitalism. And that is not to say that capitalism as a system has any like morally forgivable elements, but it is to say that socialism as a society needs to be based on a material abundance, the provision of you know, food, housing, clothing, and whatever, and that sort of thing to all the people in society necessarily requires a certain amount of like economic development, which was not present at the outset of capitalism, but like present everywhere in the world at this stage of capitalism. So the key point there is that socialism necessarily has to be built on the basis of material abundance. You can't provide for everyone's basic needs unless you have the social capacity to be able to produce those the means to meet those needs. So Marx refers to it as like a historical importance in terms of like economic development. But that's not to say that Marx thinks that there's anything sympathetic about capitalism as a system. You know, he's very consistently on the side of the working class and in favor of the oppressed and their struggles, and indeed was inspired by a large number of them throughout his life. There was there was various strikes. There were revolutions in 1848, which he was actually an active participant in, as well as things like the Paris Commune. You know, but that wasn't like he went down and told people it would be a good idea. That was the organization and the radicalism of the working class that he didn't like come up with these fine ideas and then the working class took them on. The working class taught him how we were supposed to achieve our liberation. I think I might leave it there. We've obviously gone well beyond the topic of American Psycho, but I think I've made all the points that I was going to make, or at least the ones that I can think of at the moment. I'm so glad that you've all joined in. I'm so glad that we had a bit of a tangential discussion about the history of the USSR, and I can't wait for next week's episode, which is going to be on The Big Short, which is a film, obviously again about the excesses of capitalism, but it's specifically about the mortgage prime crisis or something, the 2008 financial crisis that was driven by a collapse in housing prices because they were basically just like defrauding like financial institutions about the stability of these like groups of loans, and the subprime. Yes, that's the right word for it. So it results in the creation of all this fictitious capital. And anyway, that's going to be a discussion about obviously what the 2008 financial crisis looked like, some of its causes, and also another rant about hating Wall Street and hating the capitalist system. So that's next week, same time. I would love for you to join us then. We also have a number of other shows coming up. I think on the time zones are different. So most of you are based in the East Coast of the US, but I obviously am in Sydney. Tomorrow we have my lovely technical director, Stacey, doing her show on The Bachelor, Every Rose Has Its Thorn. And then on Friday, there's both Show and Tell, which I'm not actually sure what they're going to be talking about there. And then there's Big Time as well on Friday, which Dara is very excited about. She's got a guest burlesque performer who's been very vocal about being politically active about like the portrayal of fat people. So those are both on Friday. And yeah, if you're not already following us, if you're not already I am not here to, like, if you want to look up Shirtless Bateman, you are welcome to do that in your own time. I don't think there's anything important about him being shirtless, aside from the vanity stuff. But there's so much in the film that's, yeah. There's definitely something to be said about. There's definitely something to be said about like talking about slavery. I don't know if Willy Wonka is necessarily the film to do it, but we can talk about that. Yeah, thank you so much for coming, and I'll catch you all later.